Quiet Riot.
Hello and welcome to another extra slice of Quiet Riot, part of our election series focusing on UK nations, regions and parties which have not been adequately analysed. Today we look at the general election result in Wales and its consequences, and in line with our quietly revolutionary policies here at QRHQ, we actually have a guest who knows what the hell they're talking about. Will Hayward is a multi-award winning journalist and author based in Cardiff. He has written books on Welsh independence, on the pandemic response in Wales, and is Welsh Affairs Editor for Wales Online. Croeso I Quiet Riot, Will.
Diolch yn fawr, thank you for having me.
Will, a couple of days ago you wrote a piece charting how things went so badly wrong for Labour in Wales, especially given the stunning result elsewhere. Now, the plan was to go through the Welsh general election result and its fallout methodically, but things just got a lot worse for Welsh Labour. A couple of hours ago, Vaughan Gething, the leader of Labour in Wales and First Minister at the Senedd, resigned. So let's start from that and go backwards. What is the sort of potted summary of what happened with the Vaughan Gething affair?
So to cut a very, very long story short, back in December of last year, Mark Drakeford, who was the quite well-known First Minister of Wales, said he was going to step down. Now, two men put themselves forward to take over from him, Vaughan Gething and Jeremy Miles. During that leadership contest to be the Welsh Labour leader, Vaughan Gething took a donation, well, two donations, from a man called David Neal, who had criminal convictions for environmental offences. Now, this was controversial, not just because of the criminal convictions, but also because of how big the donation was. So it was £200,000, which in Welsh politics terms is absolutely astronomical. The spending limit was only £44,000.
Right.
Now, over the next couple of months, lots of other stuff came out about this. So the company that made the donation, on the same day that they gave him one of those donations, put in an application to build a solar farm on the outskirts of Cardiff. Now, this solar farm was of a nature that it would require Welsh Government approval. And so you'd have a situation where, if he won, the First Minister of Wales will have been put into that position on the back of money donated by a company who he would then have to make a decision about whether to approve their bid. Now,
not dissimilar to the broad outline of the Robert Jenrick affair.
The thing to stress is no rules are actually broken here, and I don't think people were necessarily suggesting that their rules were broken, but I think what people were saying is there's questions to be answered here, and if this had been a Conservative minister or a Conservative prospective leader, that Labour would have been really onto this. But then other things started to come out. So that same company, which is called Dowson Environmental Limited, that company, just 11 months before they made the £200,000 donation to Vaughan Gething, received a £400,000 loan from the Development Bank for Wales, which is a wholly Welsh Government-owned bank, which at the time, Vaughan Gething, as Economy Minister, was responsible for. So they received a lot of money from the Welsh Government, and then 11 months later they made a donation to Mr Gething's campaign. Now, again, there's no evidence of illegality here at all, and that has to be stressed. But other stuff began to happen, and eventually we ended up in a situation where Vaughan Gething won the Welsh leadership campaign, but he only won with just under 52% of the vote, and obviously 52% seems to be
not the cursed ratio.
I know, when it turned up 52%, we thought, oh God, this can only end badly. Nothing brings people together like a 52% vote, does it? And he only won by about 300 odd votes in the end, so it was quite a divided party. But then, as time went on, there was other issues. So Mr Gething, some iMessages, an iMessage group of Welsh Labour politicians was leaked to the media, within which Mr Gething said, I'm going to delete these messages because they could be captured by a Freedom of Information request. And these messages date back to the middle of the pandemic. And Mr Gething, just a month before, had told the COVID inquiry in Wales that he hadn't got any of these messages because they'd been lost when he changed phones. Again, there's no illegality suggested here, but he said that these weren't relevant to the inquiry, so there was nothing wrong with that. But on the back of this, he sacked Hannah Blythen, who was a member of his cabinet, who incidentally had supported Jeremy Miles, his opponent, and this led to a series of events, which included Plaid Cymru, which is our equivalent of the SNP in Wales. It's the Nationalist Party. They broke up the cooperation agreement which they had with Welsh Labour, which helped Welsh Labour pass legislation. And then there was a vote of no confidence in Mr Gethin inside the Senedd, which is the Welsh Parliament.
Yep.
Mr Gethin lost that vote because two members of his own party didn't bother to show up. Afterwards, Mr Gethin said, I will not resign. This is a gimmick. This is just opportunism from opposition parties. Even though Humza Yousaf, if you remember in Scotland, stepped down at the mere idea he might lose a no confidence vote. So there was more and more disharmony within Welsh Labour ranks, but then the election happened. And in a way, that was quite useful for Mr Gethin because suddenly all eyes were on Westminster and focusing on Keir Starmer. But now the election is over. The result wasn't actually very good for Welsh Labour in Wales, despite the fact they won more seats. And today, as we speak now, 4 members of his government, as you say, have stepped down, and this has led to Mr Gethin finally throwing in the towel and saying, I'm going to step down as First Minister. So that is a concise 7 months of history for you in a few minutes.
So effectively, Gethin was the Sunak of Wales during the pandemic, relatively popular with the public, that then stepped up to the top position, and that went about as well as Sunak.
I wouldn't say he was Sunak in terms of popularity. Mark Drakeford was incredibly popular during the pandemic, and Welsh Labour really rode that wave of popularity in the 2021 Senedd elections. But Mr Gethin, although he was very well recognised in Wales, and for a Welsh Government minister that is half the battle, because there isn't as big an awareness of devolved matters as there is of Westminster matters in Wales.
Yeah.
So he was recognised, but actually he never polled particularly highly, not least because there was a controversy around care homes during the pandemic, specifically to Wales, which did see him come under quite a degree of criticism.
So just to put in brackets here, that Labour hold, I believe, 30 of the 60 seats in the Senedd. So they don't have a majority, but they don't quite have a minority, as it were. So they only need a couple of people to vote with them, and they can run a minority government relatively comfortably.
Yeah, so we kind of term it that they've got a working majority. So if all of the Welsh Labour members were to vote with Mr Gethin on, for instance, a no confidence vote, he would be okay because you need a majority for something to change. But if he wanted to get through his budget, he would need someone from another party and all his own members to vote with him. And this is where he's come unstuck, and this is why members of his own cabinet have started to resign. One of the key reasons they said is there is no way he will be able to get that budget through in the autumn, and that's the budget which pays healthcare workers, teachers in Wales. Not least because there's only 3 options for him to go to. There are the Welsh Conservatives, who aren't going to vote with him in a million years. There's Plaid Cymru, who had been working with Welsh Labour until very recently, but have indicated that they won't support Labour while Mr Gethin is leader. And then there's one Liberal Democrat called Jane Dodds, and she might have been persuaded to work with him, but after he described the vote of no confidence as a gimmick, she took deep offence to that because she says she thought long and hard about this, and it wasn't political opportunism, it was the fact she simply didn't have confidence in him. So she also said, I won't work with you. So realistically, there was no prospect of Mr Gethin being able to pass a budget.
Which makes the person that takes over, the key quality they need to possess is to have some support or at least some willingness to cooperate in other parties, right?
Yeah, I think whoever takes over, they need to acknowledge the position they are in politically. And I think that's one thing that Mr Gethin struggled with because he often behaved as though he was Keir Starmer, and he had this huge majority and this huge ability to be able to do what he wanted, both in terms of not needing to court opposition MSs, which is members of the Senedd, or indeed all of his own MSs. But what they actually really need is to negotiate, to cajole, to convince, to charm other people within the Senedd, whether that's with policy decisions they make or appealing to people's desire for good governance. And he just hasn't shown an ability to be able to do that. And in his defence, he's been on the back foot since the start. And it can be hard to be magnanimous. And when you feel that you're personally under attack, that can be a hard thing to do. So that's what the next person is going to have to take on board.
Now, just before we chatted, I saw Mark Drakeford being asked about whether the allegations against Gethin were true. And his response was to say, I summarise, I paraphrase, sometimes a story takes hold and the truth doesn't matter. Is that a fair assessment?
I think when we talk about the allegations, the actual allegations are really incontrovertible. He did take that money. That person did have those convictions. and they did make those applications on the same day. None of that is really up for debate. What is really up for discussion is how you view that. And Mr. Gethin feels that he has been misrepresented with regard to these issues. It is clear from the polling especially that the Welsh public simultaneously know who Mr. Gethin is, and they don't rate his performance. And once you get to that stage, if you are going to try and put the party before yourself, and then the country even before your party, realistically, the only option is to step down, because going into 2026, I know, having spoke to the leaders of other parties in Wales, they would like nothing more, really, than Vaughan Gethin to be leading Welsh Labour when they get to that election.
Yeah. I've also seen some suggestions that his race played a part, if not in the essentials of the story, certainly in the vigour and the venom with which it has been pursued. Do you think there is something to that?
It's very hard for me, as a white guy, to tell a black politician how they felt about coverage. It's not really for me to do that. And if you go on social media, I could spend about 30 seconds before I found something which is unequivocally racist about Vaughan Gethin. There's no denying that. But as someone who covered this story, what I would say is I personally covered this with exactly the same vigour and zeal as I did when Mark Drakeford was in power. I wrote a lot of very highly critical pieces about Mr. Drakeford, also about Andrew R.T. Davies, who is the white leader of the Conservative Party and the former leader of Plaid Cymru, to whom my journalism was a key part in him actually stepping down from his role. If I was to not report things which are important to report simply because of Mr. Gethin's race, I would be holding a black First Minister to a lower standard than I would a white First Minister. But what I will say is I, like every other, I would say, right-thinking person in Wales, was very happy to see a person of colour take the top job in Wales. I think it spoke a lot to Wales as a polity. But I'm also in no way trying to diminish what Vaughan Gethin perceives. I can only say about how I reported it.
Okay, now, Will, let us circle back to the discussion we were going to have, and we'll get back to the Senedd at the end, looking forward. So, the general election in Wales, who did well, who did badly?
If you look at the seats, Welsh Labour did fantastic. So we went from 40 seats in Wales down to 32 because of the boundary changes. The boundary changes hit Welsh representation in Westminster really, really hard. But Welsh Labour won. They won 27 of those 32 seats. And you can't see that as anything other than a success from a purely political standpoint. But there is stuff that's going on underneath. So the first thing to say is the Conservatives went from 11 seats to 0. It was a complete Tory wipeout in Wales. Their vote collapsed, and even areas that they thought they might hold on to, they lost. Now, some of that was areas like Montgomeryshire and Glyndŵr, which is where Craig Williams, who was the man who made the bet on the election, was.
Yes.
He ironically, he was the Tories' only safe bet in Wales until he laid a safe bet. And then now he's lost his seat. Welsh Labour, although they won lots of seats, their share of the vote actually fell by 4%, and it was the only part of the UK that actually saw that. This is significant also because of who they lost out to. So Reform did very, very, very well. They got about 17% of the vote, and they came second in 13 of the 32 seats. Now, what is significant is where they were coming second. So it was areas like Llanelli, Pontypridd. These are areas which, if you don't know Wales, are traditionally working class, Labour voting areas, former industrial mining areas, which historically you could have put anything up with a red rosette on and people would have voted Labour. Yeah. But Reform making inroads there, they were only about 1,000 votes off winning Llanelli, which would be absolutely unthinkable. So Reform did very well in terms of vote share, not in terms of seats. But the Senedd election, which is coming up, it's a much more proportional system. The final thing I'll say is Plaid Cymru. Plaid Cymru did very well in terms of seats. It doubled its number from 2 to 4, which was their target. And their leader Rhys Iorwerth, did very well in terms of recognition. It's always very hard for Plaid to cut through in general elections, but he was perceived as doing very well in the debates. And I'll just give a brief shout out to the Green Party, which also went from 1% to 4% of the vote. And them and Plaid are both pro-Welsh independence parties, which adds another interesting element to the discussion here in Wales.
Yes, that is interesting.
Quiet Riot.
there's no way you can tell me this definitively, but obviously your guess will be a lot more educated than mine. Is there a sense in which the same fatigue that saw the Conservatives punished in England and saw the SNP punished in Scotland, because they've been in charge for a very long time, is it that we are seeing that effect in Wales because Labour has been in charge there for a very long time?
I think that's an absolutely fair assessment. I don't think it's any coincidence that the party in power was punished at the ballot box in each of the component parts of England, Wales and Scotland. I think Welsh Labour have got a pretty strong argument for them being the most successful democratic party in history. They've been the largest party in Wales since 1920. They've been the party in government here in Wales since devolution began 25 years ago in 1999. The problem is, although Vaughan Gething has been an issue for them, the overriding issue for Welsh Labour is the fact that they are not perceived by many people as making their lives better in Wales.
Yeah.
And if they are not able to demonstrate that they have made improvements in the health service in Wales, and there's a lot of data which suggests that actually the Welsh health service is performing worse than the health service in England. Now, there's lots of reasons for that, not least we have an older population here.
And a more rural composition, yeah.
Well, it's more rural, it's hard to deliver. But also, a lot of English people like to retire here, for one thing. But it costs more money to deliver the same level of healthcare in Wales as it would do in England. Also, as I've mentioned, our industrial and mining history has created a lot more health issues. We've got higher levels of, for instance, obesity and respiratory illness in Wales. But also our schools are performing worse. And if the Welsh Government aren't able to improve that, the Welsh Labour Government aren't able to, especially now there is a Labour government in Westminster, so they can no longer point down the M4 and say the Tories aren't giving us enough money. And that's going to be a real challenge for them in the coming years.
Why do you think reform has such a strong base in Wales? Last I remember about, the reform's predecessor, the Brexit Party, performance in Wales is that in the Senate they were an absolute bin fire.
Yeah, well, I think there's a difference between winning seats and representing well. They clearly have designs on Wales because Nigel Farage launched his campaign on the Gurnos estate in Merthyr Tydfil in the valleys. I think when the governing party are Labour and the Tories' name is mud, there are some people in Wales who will just never vote Conservative because of things like the miners' strikes and issues like that. They don't feel like Plaid Cymru is a place for them. Some of that is down to the Welsh language, and there aren't many other places for them to turn. But what we have seen when, as you say, the Brexit Party or UKIP or Abolish the Assembly, whatever iteration they were within the Senedd, was a nightmare. They couldn't stop fighting. The only thing they seemed to hate more than the EU was each other. So it was, I think, they do pose a real threat, because as soon as you get a certain amount of people within an institution who don't want that institution to exist or succeed, it gets very hard to govern well.
That is, in the European context, that is a nightmare approaching, I think. Now, were there issues that were important in Wales or different parts of Wales that differed from the rest of the UK, that were individual or specific to Welsh voters, that didn't really get the attention in the national conversation?
I suppose there's a couple of things you could pick up. One of them is Port Talbot and the steelworks, the concerns over that and the potential loss of jobs there. Another issue which doesn't really get any UK attention, even though it's absolute scandal really, is around HS2. So HS2 was defined by the Treasury as an England and Wales project, even though not a single inch of the line is in Wales. And what this meant was that HS2, because it was defined as England and Wales, Wales gets no Barnett consequential from that. This robbed Wales of about £5 billion. Scotland got a consequential, Northern Ireland got a consequential, England got the track, but Wales got nothing. And the argument was, well, people from Wales will be able to use it when they come to England, which I think is a fairly weak argument.
Yes.
That's like investing in a hospital in Norwich, but saying Wales doesn't get a consequential because if a Welsh person breaks their leg in Norfolk, they'll be able to go to that hospital. Wales has, I think, in England, about 70 to 80% of the line is electrified. In Wales, only 2% of our rail lines are electrified. If you want to get to Aberystwyth on the west coast of Wales, to the capital in Cardiff, you have to go via England to go on the train. This decision by first the Conservatives, but now Labour aren't going to hand over that extra money, even though when they're in opposition, their own MPs argued that it should happen. And that was actually a really big issue because it was a time of Wales being shafted, and actually Wales has issues around productivity and poverty, and you can't fix that without a good infrastructure. And I think that is an issue which has really cut through, and I'm as amazed as anyone that almost a dry story about rail funding has done as well as it has in Wales, but it really is something that a lot of people will talk about.
Which leads me actually to the state of the independence movement in Wales. How would you assess that after the recent general election?
I think the independence movement has to be seen in a longer context than just a year. Up until the 2010s, Welsh independence was merely the discussion of some bearded blokes in Carmarthen in a pub. Whereas now it regularly polls around 28, 29, 30%, which actually is pretty much where Scottish independence was just a couple of years before everyone started saying, just before the Scottish independence referendum. Now, independence in Wales is a very different beast to independence in Scotland, not least because, unlike the Scottish-England border, which is very, very depopulated, there's not a lot of traffic over it, 50% of people in Wales live within 20 miles of England. It is a really, really totally different issue. But among young people especially, Welsh independence is polling very high. Identity in Wales is an interesting thing. Historically, people in Wales were much more likely to define themselves as British. But now, increasingly, people are much more likely to define themselves as Welsh than British. And that happens much more in younger people. But there is also a strong link between this feeling that, because we've now got people, especially because we had votes for 16 in the Senedd elections in Wales, we now have people in Wales who have lived entirely under devolution. It isn't weird for them that Wales can make its own decisions. And that, I think, is fuel to the fire of Welsh independence. But compared to Scottish independence, it is a very long way behind in terms of looking at the actual practicalities of it.
Overall, of course, Wales voted to leave the European Union,
Yes.
which I think is an extra dynamic that gave quite a lot of energy to the Scottish independence argument. So, to wrap this up, how do you think this all sets us up for the 2026 Senedd election? Or will they be sooner because opposition parties are demanding a snap election now?
Well, I don't think there will be, because for one thing, the Welsh Conservatives really don't want an election because they'll get obliterated. Labour don't want an election because there's no way they'll do as well as they're doing at the moment. The ones who really want it, who are in the Senedd, are Plaid Cymru, because they are likely to make quite significant gains. It seems to me very unlikely that Labour will want to do a Rishi Sunak and rush into an election they are not ready for. Not least because this year they've had a leadership election, they've then run a general election, they're now going to run another leadership election. The idea that they will run a Senedd election, I think, is quite unlikely. But obviously, if they're not able to get votes through the Senedd, it might be the only choice. But I think cooler heads might prevail and they'll find a way to get that through.
That's a fascinating dynamic because it means that the Conservatives will want to cause mischief, but not too much. If that makes it. They're not going to want to collapse the Labour government.
No, I mean you want your opponents to be unbalanced. You don't want them to fall on top of you and crush you along with them, do you?
No, that's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Will. I feel enriched by that conversation. I feel I understand things a lot better now than I did 20 minutes ago. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and keep up the great work. I love the podcast.
That's it for this edition of Quiet Riot. If you like what you hear, do follow us, subscribe, find us on social media. You can email us on quietriotpod@gmail.com, and we'll be with you again very, very soon with the regular episode on Thursday.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreu and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Soundstone Global.
Quiet Riot.
I hear birds in the background.
Yeah, my window's open. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. That's absolutely fine. Let me just...
Yeah, I'm coming to you from the jungle.
You're coming to me from not London.